Hi everyone. So this video is to walk you guys through Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poetry. And what I've done is I've included a Prezi that I made, and I've also created this video to help you guys kind of give some context to this poetry. So I'm going to be switching back and forth between a Word doc of the poetry and the Prezi so that you guys can kind of see everything at once. But when you look at these poems, I want you guys to be thinking about specifically how the romantic elements are kind of being portrayed in this poetry. So Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, he is a he is a romantic poet, and as you read, you'll see that he writes a lot about naturalism and very nature-centric poetry. But a lot of his poetry features around these specific romantic elements that you guys have already discovered. So a lot of the native imagery, a lot of natural imagery, and a lot of things related to sort of the archaic medieval tradition. So as we're reading, I want you guys to kind of be thinking about this, and I want you guys to be able to see this. So look for references to nature's majesty or power, the sublime especially. Look at the discussions of life, fate, death. References to noble or tragic figures. So a lot of this is the quote-unquote noble savage, the slave, the lover, the poet. Look at the medieval elements, references to the divinity and divine power and influence. And then promotion of isolation and escapism from the sort of strict realities of life, urbanization, monetary difficulties, things like that. So the first one we're going to be looking at is Psalm of Life. And as we look at Psalm of Life, you'll see that it's 9 stanzas of 4 lines each. It has a very clear end rhyme, and the tone is weary, mournful, hopeful. Look for the discussion of youth versus age, so life versus death, dreams versus the waking world, and how it draws on poetry as an art form. You also see these allusions to specific literary devices that you want to pay attention to. And this idea or mentality of carpe diem. So this theme of how do we understand what it is to seize life, truly seize life, and can you do that? And then remember the idea of the sublime here is very important, and so he's actually going to name sublime in this poetry. So we're going to look over here at this poem. Forgive me, my computer's a little bit slow. So we're going to look at the Psalm of Life to start. And as we start out, we have the first person narration where it's just talking about don't be sorrowful, don't be downtrodden. Life is full of hope and promise. And I told you to kind of keep an eye out between this idea of the waking world and the dream world and how one is not necessarily exclusive from the other. So he says, life is in itself the dream. The soul is dead in life. What is the reality is the dream world. It's the things that are not what they seem. Life is real. Life is earnest. This is very strong narration. And he says the grave is not the goal. In other words, we're not trying to just get through life to be done with life. We're not just trying to get through another day. That's not the point of life. The point of life is to enjoy each and every moment, each and every day. So essentially he says that the way we move through life in an industrialized society is to get up, go to work, get our paycheck, go home, pay for things that we need. And that, he says, is not the point of life. And that is not what Romanticism is about. Romanticism is about art. Art is long, but time is fleeting. So he's saying art is everlasting. It'll endure in a way that life does not. He uses this onomatopoeia where he says, still like muffled drums are beating funeral marches to the grave. So the majority of the population, he says, just trudges through life with this very steady routine and beat. And he says we as artists need to break free from that. So we're not supposed to be, in this simile, like dumb, driven cattle. Be a hero. Remember, the romantic hero is very important. He says, be a hero in this strife. Trust no future. So nothing is about fate. Nothing is preset. We are the masters of our own fate. And he says, let the dead past bury its dead. So we are not responsible for history either. We are responsible for making our own fate. And this individualism, this idea of controlling your own fate, is a new idea in Romanticism. It's something that is active and prescient in a way that previous movements were not. So he says, act in the living present. So don't give up. Don't just trudge through life. So he says, we can make our lives sublime. We are the ones who control our own lives and footprints on the sands of time. And this is larger implications. He's not just saying we as the individual, he's saying we as a collective control how fate is shaped and how the world sees and remembers us. So this, again, he even has this inclusive language of the shipwrecked brother. And remember that this tragic language, this tragic imagery is always used in Romanticism. So he says, let us then be up and doing with the heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. So he's saying, don't give up, don't give in to the drudgery of life, keep pursuing, keep pushing artists, fellow artists out there who are struggling just to make ends meet. He's saying that in and of itself is worth the struggle. So that was a Psalm of Life. I'm going to try and move these as fast as I can. The slave singing at midnight, I want you guys to keep in mind this tragic figure, the slave. He makes multiple allusions in this one. So he talks about biblical allusions, historical and cultural allusions. He talks about death not as something to be feared, but as a release. And again, the tone is sorrowful and tragic, but still uplifting somehow. The structure here, you can see that there's an end rhyme, very clear. We have these themes of isolation and refuge from the working world, which in this case is oppressive. He does talk about references to other art forms. Here, song is a valid and valued art form. And he also talks about this emotional reaction to beauty for beauty's sake and how art bridges cultural differences. So let's go look at Slave Singing at Midnight. So this is a slightly shorter poem, but I want you guys, there's a lot packed into it. So loud he sang the Psalm of David. We're talking about a slave figure. And he says that this slave is singing of Israel's victory, Zion bright and free. So we have the multiple biblical allusions here of freedom, of victory, of overcoming. And in this case, it's overcoming both life and death. So he says, in the hour when the night is calmest, he sings from the Hebrew psalm. And his voice is sweet and clear that he, the listener, could not but choose to hear the song of triumph and ascriptions, such as reached the swart Egyptians. So this is very interesting if you think about the view of the person who is writing this. Remember the positionality of your author. Longfellow, as wonderful as his poetry is a white, privileged male in the society. So he is talking about the other in a way that is very representative of what this romanticized idea of the other is. He doesn't talk about the harsh realities of slavery, he doesn't talk about the politics, he doesn't talk about any of that sort of daily life or struggle. He talks here about a very romanticized version of this figure without actually arguing for any type of necessary change. So keep that in mind. He's making these allusions to Egypt and other slave cultures, which are not necessarily the same as the one that he's talking about. So you could argue that these kind of conflations of cultures is problematic. But he does talk about, again, in this sort of Egyptian vein, the Red Sea coast and Pharaoh. And this figure is calling out essentially to a past. And he's saying that it's filling him as the viewer with a weird emotion. Because the tones they should be sorrowful and they should be painful, but instead they're glad, solemn, and sad at the same time. So he makes more allusions here to Paul, Silas in their prisons singing of Christ and how they were raised and freed. But this is both the biblical, in both the biblical sense and literal sense. So he's saying these figures were freed by the power of nature, by an earthquake. He says, but alas, what holy angel brings the slave this glad evangel? So he's saying there is no hope ultimately for this poor figure. It's at once a sorrowful but also a hopeful tone. So he's saying, how can we free this poor figure? He's kind of the doomed, tragic hero in this sense. So you're going to see this again in other poetry from Longfellow, but I want you guys to kind of pay attention to how someone with his positionality is really talking about this and writing about this. The Day Is Done is a very interesting sort of nationalistic poem, but it's also very nature-centric. So he does have national imagery in here, which he talks about specifically the eagle, the mighty eagle. He talks about the sort of the way that his emotions are being reflected in nature, and nature is in turn being reflected in his emotions. So it's sort of a cyclical relationship between man and nature in this case. He's talking about the distance between the village and the nature, about how this isolation is purposeful. And night is the safe space here. It's a space for self-reflection. It's a space for self-reliance. And it's not something to be feared. And then he talks about this references to the power of art. So he talks about the disquiet and the unrest of the soul being quieted by art, so poetry and music. Again, he invokes the sublime, and he talks about how weariness is abated through art, nature, and even a form of religious absolution here. There is an interesting juxtaposition between silence and sound I want you guys to kind of think about. So, I'm going to go down to the day is done. So he basically starts by talking about how the day is over and we have this wings of night that are soft and gentle. This language is very gentle. It's feathers wafting downward from an eagle in his flight. And he sees the village far away, and he sees through the rain and the mist this sort of unreal sort of image of the village far away, as if it doesn't really exist in his world right now. And he's saying this feeling of sadness is coming over him, but it's not necessarily something that is negative. It's almost a feeling to be immersed in and enjoy. He says the feeling is not pain, it's sorrow that's reflected with the mist and the rain. So he is sort of becoming in symbiosis with nature, and he's really investing himself in nature, which is what the romantic is supposed to do. So he says, come, read me some poem, some simple, heartfelt lay. And then he says, this will soothe my restless feeling and banish the thoughts of day. So he will find solace and rest in art. He says, nothing from the old masters, nothing from these distant echoes of time. Give me something that is modern, something that is contemporary, is what he's saying. So he's trying to say that there's value in the art that is being created during the Romantic movement that is just as valuable as the ancient masters. And he even brings in this idea of music as a way of bringing in rest from the toil and endeavor of the day. And again, we have this sort of tragic unsung hero figure that he's lifting up, and he's saying, give me one of these humbler poets who's sort of truthful and honest in his poetry, not necessarily concerned with pride or awareness or popularity. Because he's trying to say that there's value in art for art's sake, which is something that was a very new idea at this time. It wasn't art being produced for someone or for some reason or some messaging. It was art for art's sake. Art for healing of the soul. So he's saying these songs have power to quiet this restlessness and this care of the world. And it's like benediction that follows prayer. It's like forgiveness. It's like absolution for the soul. And so really this idea of art being this healing power that's both religious and physical is something that is never been put forward before Romanticism. So note also that we have, again, this sort of exoticism enfolded in here where he says, the cares will be like the Arabs and silently steer away. So this, again, is probably somewhat problematic language if you think about it. But what he's doing is bringing in that exoticism as well. We're also going to do Evangeline, A Tale from Acadia, and I want you guys to look at some of this very epic poem. We only looked at a bit of it, but I'm just going to talk about the beginning. There's, again, this extended imagery of nature. There's this personification of nature, and the medieval imagery is very important in here. We see this lamentation of the waste of the land and the natural resources and the simple life that comes from it. And again, we also have this tragic love that comes into this, these tragic figures. So very Romeo and Juliet-esque. And it's set against the backdrop, again, of the French and Indian Wars. We have this native population being brought in, and you'll see that basically Evangeline loves this Acadian, and he's lost. And so she's trying to find him. So she finally ends up finding him after working and toiling in the industrialized city. And the irony of it is that she dies because she's tried to find him through this methodology of living in the city. And so, again, we have this idea of refuge in nature versus death versus in industrialization. But also, it's very interesting that America here is cast as a refuge against the cruel British tyranny. So we're going to go look at this one. Oh, no. I'm going to go look at this one really quickly. So he starts by saying this is the forest primeval, this is the murmuring pines and the hemlocks. So this is all these beautiful things. And then he brings in the medieval imagery with the druids and the elves and the voices that are sad and prophetic. So we have this like mystical, magical imagery that's brought in that kind of gives nature this divine quality. And we see that nature here is sort of echoing the difficulties and the shames of the past. So he says that here we hear the voice, where are the woodland voices of the huntsman? Where are the thatched roof village of the farmers? Where are all these echoes of a simpler, more pure life? And he's saying they're gone because all of these have been gone or have been supplanted by industrialization. So everything, this beautiful imagery has been destroyed. And he gives a beautiful simile when he says, scattered like dust and leaves when the mighty blast of October seized them. So it's confusion, it's chaos has been supplanted, or has supplanted this idea of purity and sort of self-sufficiency and the more Arcadian lifestyle. And he says, yet who believe in affection that hope and endures is patient, that beauty and strength and warmest devotion are still sung by the pines forest, lists the tale of Acadie, home of the happy. So then he launches the tale of Evangeline. But those are some of the main themes that you'll see in there. And then the last one I really had you guys look at is A Song of Hiawatha, which is a very famous epic poem about a real figure, Hiawatha. He was an Iroquois figure, and actually pulled it up on Wikipedia for you guys. So he was known as the Great Peacemaker, and as you can see, he helped bring together through his oration style and his ability to sort of bring together disparate views, the 5 nations into the Iroquois Confederacy. So this was a hugely important figure in Native lore, and that is what Longfellow kind of picks up on. So I gave you guys any of these options. You can pick any of the ones that you want. I put this one here just because I think it is very interesting. But I'm going to go ahead and do the first poem, the introduction, just kind of give you some ideas about how you might read this. Let me find the, forgive me. So here we still have the noble savage imagery. We have this natural imagery. These roots of American identity are here tied to Native identity, which is very significant and very interesting. And he connects this idea with the passage of time. So winter of life is the actual winter here. So the tragic figure is the Native figure who's being imposed upon by the settlers, the white settlers, and the violence that comes with them. And then we have this idea of the brave warrior in the face of danger who's sort of lamenting the changing landscape. And here he's saying manifest destiny, this idea of westward expansion, is to blame. So it's a very unique position to take. But again, remember that we have a figure who's writing about a population and a culture that he doesn't necessarily fully know or understand. This is a dramatized population. So he begins by looking at how this figure came to be. These legends, traditions came out of the same source as the figure himself, this natural world. And he says, we have these beautiful forests and dews and damp. He's making this very sort of majestic imagery about the curling smoke of wigwams and the rushing of the rivers. And it's all very romanticized with sort of these sort of almost personified imagery of nature. And he says that, this figure, this lore of the great Hiawatha comes from this land, and that's where we owe our roots to. And he's saying that the figure of Hiawatha is at once sort of tied to the natural imagery and created from the natural imagery. So even the birds and the beavers and everything else in the forest is sort of beholden to Hiawatha. And again, it's this very romanticized, very magical, very mystical imagery, which is very important. Forgive me. And he basically continues on and says, the song of Hiawatha is echoed in the forest because of what he did for his people, and that he might advance his own people through his own suffering, his own pain, his own toiling. So again, we have this tragic figure. And he says that ye who love the haunts of nature, love the sunshine, blah, blah, blah. He goes through this whole list of ideas. Listen to these wild traditions, to the song of Hiawatha. So he says, if you yourself have a romantic soul, if you are an artist, if you are a poet, if you are, a musician, take comfort and inspiration from this native figure, which is very interesting that he's using this idea of sort of the native imagery to propagate and uphold the European and the non-native population who are writing about these ideas. So it's really very interesting. And he says, ye who love a nation's legend. So at this point, we've cemented this idea of the American identity. And we are tied to these native peoples. And that is very, very significant because he's trying to say we are not our own people. We are a mixture of all of these cultures which have come together. And that is a significant point that he makes. Really, in the Romantic movement, we have this sort of multiculturalism and identity that's kind of conglomerating multiple cultures all together for the first time. And that is what I really want you guys to get to know this. He says, every human heart is human. And then he uses this language and he says that even in savage bosoms, there are longings, yearnings, strivings for the good they comprehend not. So as wonderful as this is, where he's saying we are all of one root, he brings in this idea of this savage, the noble savage, which in and of itself is a problem. This language only propagates the idea that these people are somehow at once lesser and not lesser. So it is still very problematic, the way that it's achieved, but the goal of this is very interesting in light of how we are portraying Native peoples. So I want you guys to go ahead and there is an assignment that follows this, but hopefully this has helped give you guys a good idea of some of the specific elements and things that you might talk about when it comes to Longfellow's poetry and some of these romantic works.